So this happened at Christmas a couple of years ago when I was spending the holidays with my parents and little brother along with my cousins, aunts and uncles. We live in a suburb in Ontario, but we were venturing out into the woods for Christmas. An idea that my parents had for a while. They loved the idea of being out in a hunting cabin during Christmas with their families. I'm a 22-year-old female, but at the time, I was just turning 18, and my brother Tom was 11 at the time. We're really close and do everything together. We also had a dog, a German Shepherd called Trigger, who came along for the ride too. He's a real softie, but can be really overprotective, especially of my brother Tom. Anyway, we left from our home on Christmas Eve at about 2 PM and climbed into my dad's truck, filled with all of our stuff and presents for his extended family. Now on the car journey, we were having friendly conversations as we moved along the road. We arrived at the village near the cabins we were staying in and caught up with my dad's sister, Billy, along with her husband and 3 kids. They didn't converse for long, but Billy was a bit unsure of where to go from the village to get to the cabins, so my dad helped her out by writing down directions. We soon got back on our way and arrived at the cabins at around 4 PM. There were a cluster of them sort of spaced out around the woods. Each family had a cabin, and there was one where everybody could meet up with a pool table, a swimming pool, and all sorts. It was kind of just a place where we could all meet up and chill together and enjoy each other's company. Anyway, the weather was already really cold when we arrived, and the snow was falling all around us. So as me and my brother unpacked our things into the cabin and settled in for the night, my dad started a fire, while my mum was making dinner, and we played a few board games as the night got darker. Dad, Tom and I decided before coming on the trip that we go hunting sometime, so we planned to go the next day. I've been a few times with my dad, but this was Tom's first time. He was only there to watch us though, as he was too young to shoot. It reached about 10 PM, and my brother and I were getting a bit tired, so we decided to go to bed. Now my dad kept his rifles in a bag which he kept under his bed. He usually kept it in a locked box, but there was no point since we were going hunting the next day. Tom and I were sharing a room at the end of the cabin, facing a flowing river. The river was beautiful. Tom and I fell asleep with our dog, Trigger, laying at the bottom of Tom's bed. Now, this is when things got creepy. It was about 3 AM when I woke up to Trigger growling. I didn't find this particularly unusual because my dad suffers from insomnia, so sometimes, when he can't sleep, he'll sit up watching TV. And like I said, Trigger is extremely overprotective and growls at any noise that he hears. But that's when I noticed that there was no light coming from under my door. My dad never sits there in the dark. I was only whispering to Trigger. I wanted to be quiet as to not wake up Tom, but his growling soon turned to barking, which woke Tom up. He asked me what was going on, but I said Trigger must have heard some deer or something outside. After all, we're in the middle of the woods. Suddenly, a bedroom door swung open and the light switch was turned on. My eyes actually stung for a couple of seconds as I tried to focus on whoever it was at the door. It was my dad. "What are you two laughing about?" he said as I turned to look at Tom, his eyes wide and his face pale. "No," I replied as he moved over towards the curtains, pulling it back over as he looked out into the pitch black wilderness. "What are you looking at?" Tom said to our dad as he closed the curtains again. "Nothing, just go back to sleep." I was creeped out by the fact that my dad didn't say anything about what was going on. He turned off our lights and we tried to fall back asleep. Of course I couldn't though. I was wide awake for the rest of the night, lynching at every single sound outside. Now it must have been about 4:30 AM when I finally drifted off, but it must have been moments later that I heard some strange crunching noises coming from outside our window. I was sure this wasn't some kind of animal. It sounded like footsteps. I felt fear beginning to overwhelm me. I covered my face with my blanket. Sweat began to cover my forehead. I then heard a faint tapping on our window, which lasted for a good few minutes. I was too petrified to move. Trigger was awake by this point, and I saw his face turn towards the window. His ears pointed, listening intensely. The tapping then started again, but louder this time, causing Trigger to bare his teeth. What happened next was the most terrifying thing that's ever happened to me. "I know you're in there, little guy," this deep and husky voice whispered as a horrible shiver went down my spine. "Why don't you come out to play with me?" Instantly, I was filled with rage. I thought that it was bound to be one of my cousins playing a stupid prank on us, so I leaned forward and peeked through the gap in the curtain, ready to tell them to go away. But standing there wasn't any of our cousins. It was a creepy old man who was around 60. His hair was matted and very dirty. He looked ancient. He was stroking the window with his hands, breathing on it as he spoke. I went into protective mode. I don't know what else to do. I grabbed my dad's hunting rifle from under my bed and pulled the curtain back. "Get out of here or I'll drop you." I felt adrenaline rushing through me as the creepy man's eyes widened, and the most terrifying smile appeared on his face. Trigger then began barking, louder than I've ever heard him bark before. My parents obviously heard the commotion and come running through to our room, turning the light on. My mum screamed as she saw the old man through the window. Trigger fiercely barked at the man again. My dad yelled at the man, telling him that the police are on their way, but the man legged it back into the woods. Tom was petrified, but I was angry more than anything else. How could some sicko do this? I was just extremely glad that I had a hunting rifle. The cops caught this guy a few minutes later and arrested him. I found out a couple of days later that the creepy guy was homeless and living out in the woods, suffering from lots of mental issues. It scares me to death to think about what could have happened to my brother hadn't I not been there. We spent the remainder of Christmas Day at the cabin, but we stayed in our Aunt Billy's overnight. There was no way we were spending the night in there alone after what happened. We went home first thing on Boxing Day and never looked back. My dad only told me the other day that he knew that somebody was hanging around our cabin, so he intentionally left the rifle under my bed just in case we had to use it. He did that because he didn't want to scare any of us. He called the police after he heard the guy laughing outside my bedroom window, singing nursery rhymes. I was 11 when this happened. Ariel, my older sister, was 14, and Bella, my younger sister, was about 8. My dad was a freelance programmer when I was younger. He made good money on this, but he was heavily in debt. My mum was not the most gifted person on balancing a budget. We never had much free money available. This meant that we would go on vacation every couple of years, usually to a relative's house. Now my dad had just finished a long project for a big client, and we were celebrating the occasion with a movie. My dad loved watching scary stuff and scaring the daylights out of me. So we're in the middle of the movie when the phone rang. He went to get it and come back to grab my mum while we kept on watching the movie. Bella took the opportunity to pause the film and take Duchess, our dog, captive because she is scared. They come back about 10 minutes later and announce that we were going to be spending the weekend in a cabin. We didn't really know what to make of this, but apparently the client my dad had been working with owned a big cabin by a lake in the mountains. He offered us to lodge there this weekend at a considerably reduced price. It was Thursday, so my mum went into a panicked frenzy of packing so we didn't see the rest of the movie that night. After school the next day, we packed up the family van and headed into the mountains. It was a 2.5 hour drive, so it was late by the time we got there. We unloaded the van and went exploring the cabin. It was a ranch style cabin with a little nook thing you could climb up to about head height. It was about 3 feet tall and probably meant for storage, but it was an excellent place for the 3 of us to hang out in and play games. There was a couple of board games up there. We started playing once we had decided on the rooms. My mum and dad got the biggest one. Ariel claimed the smaller one with a twin bed, so Bella and I got the last room, which had a queen-size bed we could share. We had a window on the right side of the bed without a curtain, and a lamp on the left side of the bed. It was the only light source in the room, and there was a closet opposite the bed. It was locked, so we couldn't get in. We went to bed at around 11. Bella is a kicker, so I slept by the lamp just in case she ended up knocking it over. I remembered lying down, and I must have intensely fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, Bella was gripping my arm and trying to burrow under me. She was squeaking about something in fright, and I couldn't understand what was happening. I sat up, looked towards her, and saw something pale and human-shaped moving away from the window. My sleepy brain took several moments to process what it was, then I was shooting out of bed and dragging Bella with me. We rushed over to our parents, who told us that we're imagining everything. My mum told us to go back to bed, and if we saw anything else to let them know. I, much to my current annoyance, agreed with them and went back to the room with Bella. We changed positions because she refused to go by the bed near the window. I told her a story to get her asleep, and eventually fell asleep too. I didn't wake up until the next morning. We spent the next day exploring around the lake for about an hour before my dad decided that we'd spend the day in town. They had a lot of small shops, and my parents went into every one of them. We ate lunch and dinner in town and finally went back to the cabin. Ariel made a joke about something as we neared the cabin, and I remembered everybody laughing before my dad suddenly held up his hand to make everyone stop. He took another step towards the cabin and pushed the door open with a finger. I thought it was strange that the door wasn't latched, but didn't put the obvious together right away. I said Dad, but he shook his head for me to be quiet. He went into the cabin and disappeared for a minute or two. We stood on the porch. My mum called out his name, and he called back that we were allowed to come inside. When we made our way back inside, we found him standing in the middle of the living room with a frown. He locked the door once we went inside and took my mum to the bathroom for a quick talk. Ariel, having caught on to what was happening, opted to distract Bella, suggesting that we played another board game, just to distract things. We hadn't been playing for more than 5 minutes when my mum and dad come back. My mum went about cleaning the dishes from breakfast and my dad joined us. We played for a few hours before my dad told us that we had to go to bed. It was only 9 at this point. Ariel was mad. She was allowed to stay up until 10:30 on school nights, and later on weekends. Bella and I went on to bed, and they argued. We climbed back into the same spots that we slept in, Bella by the window and me by the lamp. I read to Bella for a bit before we both drifted off. I woke to my dad rushing into our room. He scooped Bella out of bed and grabbed my hand. As we were rushed out of our bed, I saw Ariel getting similar treatment by my mum. I became aware of a high-pitched whining in the living room and saw our dog sitting at attention by the back door. She seemed very nervous. My dad didn't put Bella down and didn't let go of my hand. They rushed us out of the house and into the van. My dad went back to get our dog, and then he burned rubber to get out of the cabin. He drove all the way home without talking once. It took about an hour for Duchess to calm down. He told Ariel what happened the next day, but Bella and I didn't find out until years later. He woke up that night to what sounded like moaning outside the window to his room. He jumped up and looked to see what was going on, and he found the front door was unlocked. Stuff in the kitchen had been moved, and Duchess started to growl at the back door, which was ajar. He locked it and got all of us out of there. He went back the next day to go and get our luggage, and found several pairs of footprints outside Bella's and my window. Different footprints by multiple people. So this story happened earlier this year, but I'm just getting around to writing it now. A couple of years ago, I said about an encounter my wife and I had while driving to my family's cabin. And even though the story takes place at the same location, they're completely unrelated. So, onward. My family owns a cabin in upstate New Hampshire, and this is literally my favourite place in the world. It's on a small, very secluded lake, shared by only a few other cabins. One other cabin on my side, 6 in total. Most of my neighbours only visit during spring-fall months, and even though it's pretty rare to run into one of them, we all pretty much leave each other to do our own thing, but we also try to look out for each other as best we can. We occasionally check in on each other's properties during off-season visits. We make sure that there's been no break-ins or anything. We all try and be good neighbours. The lake is a pretty popular fishing location in the area as a result of being so secluded. It's not unusual for us to see people who don't live there hiking or messing around in a boat with a fishing pole. In the winter, it becomes a popular place for ice fishing and snowmobiling. Now, it kind of reinforces why all of us own property on the lake to try and look out for one another, as there are people coming and going all the time. There's been a few break-ins over the years, but honestly, in 30 plus years, I've been going up to the cabin and I've only ever seen a handful. Now occasionally somebody's canoe or kayak will go missing, but that's basically the worst of it. That's until this winter. So my wife and I decided to take a long vacation to the cabin this winter. She was getting ready to start a new job. I had leftover PTO from the previous year, so we figured we should take the opportunity to get away before our schedule started to get busy again in spring. It was sort of impromptu, but once we got the idea of spending a weekend there, relaxing by the wood stove, drinking beers, winter hiking, binge watching DVDs, we couldn't get the thought out of our heads. So 2 weeks later, we were packing up into my father's F-150 and on the road. Things got weird immediately, but first, there are a couple of things you need to know about this location. The lake basically sits in the middle of a dead zone as far as wireless connection goes. Sometimes you can randomly get a couple of bars, but never with regularity. The isolation and feeling of being unplugged is one of the main reasons I love to go up to the cabin. It becomes a lot easier to not glue to your phone and just start to appreciate things. Secondly, as mentioned before, this place is secluded. It's a solid 10-minute drive before the reception kicks in with any kind of consistency, and about another 5 before you reach town. Now a couple of years ago, and after much debate within the family, we decided to go break down and get a satellite dish installed so we would have some proper connection with the outside world. We essentially have basic cable for news and weather and a phone line. However, my folks have the service suspended at the start of winter since our family rarely visits during their months. So my wife and I are heading up without a phone connection, but it had never been a problem before, so we didn't really think much of it. It hadn't snowed that much in our area, but the ground was still covered in a few inches of old snow. There were actually snowmobile tracks everywhere, all over the place. Before reaching our final turn off towards the cabin, you had to drive across a causeway, and while crossing it, you would get a really good view of both sides of the lake. I looked out over the lake and saw what appeared to be 2 guys ice fishing, sitting at a picnic table out in the middle of the side of our lake. That was my neighbour's picnic table. I knew right away that it was because his very distinct paint job. The exact thing had actually happened before, and the last group of fishermen that did so left ice on his table. As a result, part of the table broke. Because of this, my neighbour had chained his new picnic table to concrete footing on the edge of his property. So that meant these guys either broke off the table to get it out by the lake, or they broke the chain. I'm also pretty confident that it wasn't my neighbour out on the ice because he lives in Florida. He doesn't fish, and never comes during the winter. This annoys me. I said something like, "Again? What the hell? What's their problem?" to my wife. She was thinking the same thing. Both of us were in agreement. I then sped up to get towards the cabin before they could run off. I didn't really have a plan, but I figured that I would go yell at them and threaten to call the cops if they didn't put it back. I kind of figured that as soon as they saw the truck turn down the road, they would take off. I was right, but oddly, right more than I knew. As I was coming down the road, I noticed a few things that struck me as odd. First, there were two dudes jumping onto and starting up snowmobiles that were parked in front of my neighbour's cabin. Secondly, the front door to the cabin was wide open, the lights were on, and there was smoke in the chimney. I stopped the truck about 50 feet away from his driveway and watched as the two guys drove the snowmobiles out onto the lake, picking up their buddies, then speeding off into the woods. We kinda just sat there for a minute or two, dumbfounded. I wasn't really sure what was going on, but it definitely didn't feel right. I guess it was technically possible that my neighbour was visiting, or that maybe he rented his cabin out to some people, but my gut told me that this was not the case. There were no cars in his driveway, and the guys on the snowmobiles were definitely in some kind of hurry when we pulled up. It was like 10 degrees outside. Why would they leave the door open? After snapping out of it, I parked the truck in front of our cabin and walked over to the edge of the lake. Now sound travels pretty far out on the lake. I could hear the snowmobiles getting further and further away. I unlocked our cabin, threw a quick start log into the stove, and then my wife and I headed over to my neighbour's cabin with our dog. We called out hello a few times, and then I tried, "Are you here?" and got nothing. As we got closer, I could clearly see that the front door was splintered and had been pierced open. My wife and I had unknowingly pulled up while people were actively breaking into my neighbour's cabin. Not exactly an ideal way to start relaxing in our winter getaway. Now my family's on really good terms with my neighbour, so I went ahead and stepped inside to check it out. There was a fresh pile of wood by the stove which was roaring, and the kitchen had some paper plates, food, empty beer cans, and cigarette butts strewn about. Nothing was broken or missing that I could tell. The place was an absolute mess though, it reeked of cigarettes. It was as if they'd just come and decided to help themselves to my neighbour's cabin as their own. There were actually some sleeping bags there, and a cooler in the living room, so it looked like they'd been planning to stay there for more than a day. I wasn't in the cabin for more than a minute or so. I made sure that I didn't touch anything. I did however snap a picture for my neighbour and the cops, and then stuffed out the wood stove. I also decided to close the front door the best I could when I left, wearing gloves. Now the next couple of hours were pretty bunk. We drove into town and reported the break-in to the police. After giving our report, we got in touch with my neighbour, who was understandably very upset. I did my best to assure him that it wasn't that bad, and that considering all things, it would only take some clearing up. I offered to do it since I'd be there for a week, but he insisted that he'd gone up there to do it himself. He was going to make plans to fly up from Florida to deal with everything ASAP, but asked if I could nail a couple of boards across the broken door for now. The police were heading to check out the property. When we got to our cabin, the police were already at my neighbour's cabin checking things out. One of them come over and asked if I would walk through the door with them and explain what had happened. I retold the story, and it ended along the lines of, so I left after shutting down the stove and closing the door behind me. I got some weird look and the conversation went like this. "Are you sure you closed the door? It was open when we got here." "Yeah, I definitely shut it." "Well, it was open, and the items you described aren't there either. Sleeping bags, cooler, they're not there. It looks like they must have come back to retrieve them." That was pretty unnerving for some reason. Why risk coming all the way back for sleeping bags and a cooler after escaping? They couldn't have known for certain what we did and didn't do in terms of calling the police. So the cops suspected that they were watching us, and right after we came back, they left to go and get the stuff. Or that there was somebody else in the area that we didn't see. I listened to the snowmobiles driving off and they got pretty far away. They kept going until I couldn't hear them anymore, and on the woods on the other side of the lake is completely untouched wilderness for miles. I know because I hunt turkey there, so I personally think that somebody was close by and watching us. My wife really liked that little bit of information, especially because a few years ago we basically had been followed by creepers on a previous trip to our cabin. The whole situation was just a giant downer. After a while the cops finished up and let us know that they would keep a cruiser in the area, and that they were going to check out the other cabins for any signs of break-ins. I nailed my neighbour's door shut, dragged the picnic table out of the ice and headed back inside for a much needed beer, or 4. We had debated a little about cancelling the trip and heading home, but in honesty, we were just determined to enjoy our week because we'd been really looking forward to it. Now the next couple of days were great. We did exactly what we planned on doing, which was mostly nothing. We watched movies, etc. All in all, we had a really great time. Every time that we heard a snowmobile, we both looked at each other and would check outside, but luckily nothing come from it. As much as we were enjoying being completely overindulgent and bedridden, by midweek, we wanted to stretch our legs, so decided to go for a hike. It was a beautiful day. I knew the surrounding area very well, so I suggested we hiked up the dam at the mouth of the river. This feeds into the lake. It freezes over in the winter and looks really cool. It was about a 2 or 3 hour hike around, depending on the pace, short and sweet. We brought our dog along, and again, we're having a great time, enjoying the extreme serenic winter woods and each other's company. On our way back, things took an unfortunate turn, so while about 2-ish miles from the cabin, we heard the whine of snowmobiles. We made a funny face, joked, and then got quiet and kept listening. They're getting closer at this time. It wasn't exactly unexpected. It was a gorgeous day out, and we're smack bang in the middle of the snowmobile territory. But given everything that had happened earlier in the week, it was impossible not to feel uneasy. The snowmobiles kept getting closer, and the whine was getting louder and louder. My wife and I talked about something, but honestly, I really didn't listen to her. I was going over the situation in my head. I don't quite remember what we were talking about. The engine sounds were getting louder, and it was obvious that they were coming down the same trail that we're on. I suppose it could have been anyone, perhaps a father and son enjoying the day, or a couple of friends off for a meet-up with their buddies. Regardless, I got a really bad feeling. Now I carry a gun, so I made the decision to unholster, rack around into the chamber and reholster, just in case. Now the trail that we're on was about 5 or 6 feet wide, so once the snowmobiles come into view, I picked up our dog, and he's just a little guy so I could quickly carry him, and then we stood off to the edge of the trail so they could pass us. I think we played it pretty standard as far as that gone. The moment they saw us, they stopped in the middle of the trail about 100 feet away from us. I waved. They didn't wave back. I could see that they were talking back and forth. They were occasionally glancing over at us. They seemed to finish up their conversation and gunned their engines. Both of them started approaching very quick and appeared to be online to hit us. My wife and I stepped back a few steps into the bush, and they flew past us at full throttle. I'm talking inches, not feet. They continued for a bit, stopped and turned around again. I instinctively, almost as a reflex, threw my free arm into the air and yelled, "What's your problem?" One of them replied with a middle finger and revved the engine a few times, and they both took off down the trail. My wife was a wreck afterwards. I was scared, but she was really scared. The trail that we're on basically ends where our property begins, so if it is the same people from earlier, they would know that we weren't home. So we had another 30 minutes of hiking before we got back, and the whole time, we could hear the snowmobiles ahead of us. They didn't disappear and got further away like before. The entire walk back, they were completely within earshot. After about 10 minutes, we could hear that they had stopped, and then started driving around at low RPM, engine still running but not at full throttle. After a few minutes, they started at full blast again. This time they're actually getting further away. We waited until we couldn't see them again, and then headed for the cabin. When we got back, there were snowmobile tracks all around the property, front and back. They had been circling it. We had no way of calling or contacting the cops, so after an extremely short and extremely tense conversation, we promptly packed up, closed up the cabin and left for home, vacation officially ruined. We eventually contacted the police. They were certainly sympathetic, and again, given the break-in at my neighbour's, seemed pretty concerned about it, but there wasn't much they could do. Since returning, I'm not really sure if I ever want to go back to the cabin again. The problem is, I don't know who they were or what they wanted, and we're miles and miles into the isolation of the wilderness with very little reception or ways to get help. It was in the early 80s, when I was about 8. My family was visiting my uncle who lived in the backwoods of Missouri. He lived on a lot of land. The only other people who really even lived on the street were relatives, so nobody ever just happened to be out there. This meant that nobody even locked their doors, because random family members were always coming by. So one night while we're there, my parents, auntie and uncle decided to go to a nearby town to go bowling. My brothers, who were 11 and 12, and my female cousins, who's 6 and 14, and I stayed at home. It was still daylight when the adults left, but it started raining very hard and got dark very quickly. We used to play this game that was essentially hide and seek in the dark home, but we cleverly called it vampire. There was a thin little mattress on the living room floor that some of the kids would sleep on at night. So the person who was it would lie down on the mattress and fold it over themselves like a coffin, count down to midnight. When they got to midnight, they went around looking for you. All of the lights were off and you tried to make it back to the coffin before you got caught. Because the home was in the country, it was pitch black at night. I mean, you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. This meant that you couldn't see where the vampire was looking, so you just had to make a break for it. If you were extremely lazy, you could hide in the living room with the coffin and get to the base quickly. Ben, my 11-year-old brother, was it and was doing the normal countdown. I was hiding maybe 6 feet away from him. As he was counting, there was a flash of lightning. I don't know if I was already looking down at the living room window or if the lightning made me look, but with the backlight from the lightning, I was able to see a face. There's a man with his face pressed up against the window. He had his hands on each side of his face as if he's trying to peer in to see exactly what people were doing. I could feel every hair on my body stand on end. Immediately, I began trying to convince myself that I didn't see what I just saw. But then Ben whispered, "If anyone is hiding there, stay still." I sort of croaked out and, "I'm here," right as there was another flash of lightning. The creeper was still there, but was no longer trying to look into the window. He was now looking towards the front door. Ben and I immediately knew what was coming next. From where we were standing, the creeper was probably about 5 feet away from the front door. Ben was the same distance, but there was a couch between him and the door. Ben leaped over and locked the door right as the creeper went for the handle. At this point, I guess Ben decided that it was best to let the creepster know that the people were home and that we knew he was there, because he flipped on the porch light and started turning on the lights in the home. This is gonna sound so weird, but I was too terrified to even panic. Having said that, I was relying completely on Ben to tell me and let me know what to do. He told me to go lock the door, and was yelling for everybody to come out and lock all the windows. Honestly, the next few minutes were a haze in my mind. I remembered everything up until this point extremely clearly. Then, I remembered the end very clearly. I know that I went to lock the side door, and then the sliding glass door on the back of the home. We've talked about it over the years. Some people remembered us seeing him out the back door as well. What I really clearly recall is locking the sliding glass door and standing there frozen and hearing Ben, in a very calm but firm voice, say, "Close the curtain." Okay, close the curtain. So I did, but can't remember that part. I just remember my fear and Ben's voice. We did try and call the police, but my auntie and uncle had a stupid party line. It didn't work. Whether from the storm or from a neighbour leaving, it didn't work. For the record, they're the only people that I've ever known with a party line, so this wasn't normal to me either. But for those of you who don't know, multiple people on the street would actually share a phone line. It would have different rings for different households, but you could listen to the phone and listen to your neighbour's conversation. We also tried to summon help on my CB radio, but couldn't reach anyone. My uncle was a hunter. He had a gun rack full of rifles in his room, but my older cousin was out of town hunting and took all of them with him. All we could find was a BB gun that looked real. I remembered Ben putting me on the phone and Scott on CB duty while he stood there with that little square window. He then pulled out the BB gun and aimed it. Maybe 30 minutes later, Ben said, "He's back, he's coming up the driveway." The rest of us froze in fear, but Ben opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch, pointing the gun. He said, "Get out here right now." Then we hear our cousin Kyle, who lived down the road a bit, say, "You know that's a BB gun, right?" Even though Kyle was only 15, I remembered that we felt like we had been saved when he showed up. Kyle was very skeptical of what we said, like we were playing a prank on him, even though we had no idea that he was coming, but he stayed with us until our parents come home. Honestly, I don't remember if we even told our parents what happened when they got home. There was definitely no police involvement. We just went on with our trip. I work in a theatre. I had been let off a couple of hours early. I had to wait for my ride to come pick me up, because I lived on the other side of town from the theatre. This happens a lot, and while it's inconvenient, I like to go inside the theatres and watch whatever movie is playing while I wait. It passes the time. I decided to watch 20 minutes of Red Sparrow. It was playing in one of the larger auditoriums. I went and sat down in one of the areas that is assigned to the screen, row D. Now in my theatre, we actually have assigned seating. When people purchase their tickets at the beginning of the transaction, they're guaranteed that space for 2 hours, and they're supposed to adhere to whatever seat they're sitting in, no matter what. We have a very strict no switching seats policy. So I looked behind me and saw the outlines of 2 people. Just 2. It was a slow Wednesday. One of them was up in row I or L, and the other one was closer in row G. So anyway, the film went on, and I heard them saying, "This is stupid. Yeah, this is really bad." I identified the voice of the person sitting in G because I work there. I'm very accustomed to identifying distributions and notifying the manager. This man kept on muttering other things and started swearing a lot. I was about to alert the manager when he rose from his seat. I watched as he stood up in the aisle and froze for a few seconds. His eyes were on the screen. Then he started walking down towards the exit. I thought he was going to leave and demand a refund, and my alertness dropped. I was relieved because he seemed clearly hostile and angry. I was happy to see him go away, but to my annoyance, he didn't. Instead, he stood on the ramp leading to the exit and just started jangling his keys like he was playing with them. He was tossing them around as if he was trying to play with them or something. He kept on muttering to himself. I then felt dread. You know that feeling you get when you believe something bad is about to happen? Yeah, I felt it, and it was horrible. I looked behind me one final time, and I shouldn't have. Suddenly, he moved very quickly and erratically, and took a seat exactly 2 away from me. In the entire theatre, he chose that seat. It was on purpose. I have long hair, and through my long hair and peripheral vision, I could see that he'd tilted his head now and was staring directly at me. He was grinning. He was an older white man, at least 60 years old. I waited 2 minutes. The entire time he kept his gaze on me. Eventually, I got up and walked towards the exit. I called my ride and asked where she was. As I stood in the doorway between the theatre and exit, I saw the man slowly turn his head and stare directly at me. I felt the eyes on me, grinning still. I opened the exit door and ran. I ended up telling the management about how strange the man was. I have no idea how it ended up being dealt with. I was 12, and my older sister and I were home alone for the weekend. I was waiting for a friend to pick me up and getting restless. There was a knock on the door. Thinking it was her, I ran over to answer it without checking through the peephole. A man was standing there with a clipboard, and he said that he needed to check out our gas meter. I was entrenched in the disappointment of my friend still not having arrived. I told him, "Yeah, sure, whatever, do what you gotta do." I noticed at the time, he wasn't dressed as a city official. He had a green and purple shirt on, with bold stripes like the host of the Blues Clues. He came in and immediately went up the stairs to where our bedrooms were and walked into the door of my room. The typical girly room, with glitter and stuff everywhere. Thank God my sister came down the stairs at almost the exact same moment. She said, "Oh, isn't that John's dad? Why is he going upstairs?" I then complained back to her saying that John wasn't here, and what was going on, and she was annoying me. My sister then cut me off. Wait, if John isn't here, who's that?" "Oh, he's here to check the gas meters." Her face then turned white. She flung open the front door and dragged me out. Hand clamped over my mouth. She said, "Our gas meter is outside." Neither of us had a cell phone. It was in the 1960s, and obviously, we weren't going back into the home to call the authorities on the landline. Then my sister had a stroke of genius. She saw a guy walking past our home and motioned him over. She called loudly into the home, "Oh, Dad, it's good you're home. A man from the city is here reading the gas meter upstairs." And just like she had hoped, this man on the street said, "What are you talking about?" The man in the striped shirt bolted out of the home. The man on the street asked us repeatedly if we were okay, if we needed him to stay and wait in the yard with us until our mum and dad come home. He was very sweet. We were so startled that we barely thanked him before slamming the door shut and locking all the windows. Now, as irate as my sister was, I let somebody into the home. She begged me not to call the authorities, because my parents left her in charge and she was worried she'd get into trouble. I really didn't want to catch any heat from this, so I just agreed. 3 weeks later, a girl in our community went missing. The same MO. She was home alone, and authorities found her door open and no signs of a forced entry. My sister and I discussed our options, but deep down, we knew that we had to come clean. We told the police everything. I don't know if it ever helped, but they did tell us that they had reason to believe it is the same person. They also tracked down the man who helped us on the street. Turns out, we already knew him. He worked in the butcher shop, just didn't recognise him. He was lifelong friends with the family after that. Our parents were mortified. They weren't angry with us, just glad that we didn't get hurt. Though they did review all the rules of caution and didn't let us stay home alone. They found the girl and said that she'd been held for a few days, then burned alive. Sadly, they never caught the guy, but at least I know that he's dead by now because he was in his 30s in the 1960s. I just thank God every day for my sister's resourcefulness and quick thinking. Before I begin, you should know that I live in a very shady part of Melbourne, Australia. It's had its fair share of shootings, robberies and creepy folk, which is highly unusual for this country. So I understand that it's not unusual for this kind of thing to happen in my town. I live with my sister and her partner in a small home after moving away from my parents. I've always lived in a small country town or rural areas, so I've never experienced life in a bigger, more suburban area. It was only about a month ago when I was lying in bed hot. I'd left my window open to take advantage of the non-existent breeze. I remembered how it was hard to relax, and I felt some relief when I finally drifted off to sleep. That's when I started hearing crunching on the gravel from the garden right outside my window. They were footsteps. They're unmistakable and so close to me. It jolted me awake. I actually thought that I'd imagined it, but I knew that I'd heard it. I froze in place, and then this coldness washed over me. That's when I heard the sound of tapping at my window. It was so close to where I was lying. That's when I remembered that I'd left my window open. No mesh screen to protect me or anything. No lock. Nothing. All I could think about was somebody climbing in. Now I must have been lying there for about an hour when I saw a bright light of the torch pointed against my curtains. It was only there for a second before they turned it off. It then seemingly disappeared after that. To this day, I have no idea who it was or what their intentions were. My mum owns her own business and works extremely hard. This means that she spends many late nights sitting on the living room floor with her work sprawled out around her. One night back in 2003, she had a typical routine going on, sorting through paperwork and making piles. It was late, close to midnight on a Wednesday, so when the phone rang, she was a bit surprised. My dad worked a third shift at the factory, so she assumed it was him. When she answered the phone, there was no reply, just lots of heavy breathing. Admittedly, she hung up and called my dad, creeped out. He told her that he hadn't called her, and she left it at that. Keep in mind this is almost 15 years ago, and we live in a small town with practically no crime. We never locked our doors, and we're never scared of dangerous people. But the phone keeps calling, every night, multiple times a night, and the person on the other end even started talking. He started by saying, "Hello Diane, you're beautiful. I'd love to meet you." Things escalated, and he got into graphic detail of how he wanted to do terrible things to her. Of course she stopped answering the phone and called the police, but nothing was ever done, and the phone calls just kept on coming. My parents weren't in the situation where my dad could stay home from work. My mum truly believed that the calls were just empty threats, but things continued on. One night he got brave. My mum was sitting on the floor in front of the huge mirrored cabinet with all of her work around her when the phone rang. She ignored it like normal. She was concentrating hard on a piece of paper in front of her when a glimmer of light caught her eye in the mirror. She looked up to see a pair of glasses staring at her through the mirror. She spun around to the front door, and she saw that a man was there staring at her. She said that they both just stared at each other for what felt like forever until she saw the doorknob turn. She was froze with fear, but eventually let out a scream. The man quickly ran away. In light of the phone calls, my parents started locking all the doors, which was a totally foreign concept to our household. My older brother, who was about 17 at the time, was aware of the phone calls and come running downstairs with a baseball bat, but the man was long gone. When the police come, they secured our property and looked over it and found close to 200 cigarette butts underneath our living room windows behind bushes. He'd been watching us there for months. The police also happened to find a bike tyre coming off from the windows and going down a sidewalk. They took the cigarette butts away for DNA testing and were able to match them to a convicted rapist who lived down the street from us. So I work in the service industry for beauty, etc. A few years ago, there was a very strange, very creepy client who had come in for a series of treatments, which meant me and 3 other girls would see him several times a week. He would always come to his appointments with weird things like a book about lucid dreaming and whatnot. He was really creepy. We all agreed that he was a complete weirdo. Luckily, after a few weeks, we were free from his crazy self. Fast forward to this past winter. He calls in out of the blue. He says that he wants to start these treatments again. I begged my boss not to have him come in, but there wasn't really a reason not to have him. He's in his early 20s, rich, and wants to spend all of his mum's money. And he was speaking to me over the phone. He remembered everything about me and began to apologise for being rude in the past. The first few treatments my co-worker would do with me, but after a few weeks she couldn't work that late anymore, so I was alone. He constantly tried to get me alone in the room with him. First he would be asking questions about the treatment, then more about myself. On more than one occasion, he was definitely high out of his mind and would say the weirdest things. Saying this, it doesn't sound too bad, but picture a serial killer, like the ones from movies and how they would behave. I'm not even joking, he was the scariest person that I've ever met in my life. The day I finally had enough was when he come in wearing a suit. During the treatment, he complimented me over and over again, then asked me about how I felt being murdered. He then went on to say about how women are horrible. I become increasingly nervous, and he would try laugh or contain his laughter while he was talking about murder and stuff. After his treatment was done, I immediately called him a cab. He would usually ask me to do it, but I did it way earlier than he actually wanted. Just before he left, he said that, "I find it adorable that you're so vulnerable." He then stood there staring at me with honestly the coldest eyes that I've ever seen, not even a slight smirk. I then almost started bawling my eyes out right in front of him. I could feel my heart racing and I was sweating profusely. Before he left, he said he forgot something in the room and stood there waiting for me to go and get it for him. Now if I actually went into that room, he could have easily followed me and blocked the doorway. I could have easily been trapped in there. After 8 AM, it was winter and very dark out. The streets around me are dead. The other tenants in the buildings always leave at about 5 or 6. He just stood there staring at me as I sat at my desk, literally clutching a pair of scissors away from his view. He then came in and grabbed the item that he had forgotten and asked me to help clean up, which obviously I said no, and locked the door as he was gone. I watched him get into his cab and then ran to my car, literally crying the hardest I've ever cried in my life. He called several more days later and tried to explain to my co-workers that he thought that he scared me and wanted to say sorry. I never spoke to him again. I told my boss what happened, to which he banned him from ever returning. A friend of mine's house burnt to the ground when I was younger. and his family moved across the street in a home that they rented for a bit. The basement in said house was unfinished, so being middle schoolers, we decided we would use a basement to ride skateboards and scooters. So after one night of skateboarding, we headed upstairs to watch scary movies and then pass out. Neither of his parents nor sister were home. As we were getting close to sleep, we hear something hit the ground really hard on the concrete of the basement. Being the dumb teenagers that we were, we decided to investigate. As we opened the door to the basement, we peered down. We just see a skateboard floating there. We sit and watch it for a few seconds, then it suddenly and violently drops. Needless to say, we packed up our stuff and sprint back to my home. Not much sleep happened that night. His family moved out soon after, and we never knew what actually caused this or what was going on in that basement. This story is about an event that happened to my mother around 1972. She was 8 years old at the time. She told me about this since I was young, and she truly thinks it's affected her to this day. To set the scene, both of my grandparents run a restaurant and gas station in our hometown. They've always run a business of some type since the 50s. This means that a lot of the days my mom would have to take the school bus home and stay by herself if my grandma had to stay and help run things. My uncle, her older brother, would usually come home on the bus with her, but he was a little older and sometimes had football practice. The same happened on the day of this event I'm about to say. So my mother arrived home on this day, let herself in the home and put her stuff away. She had just recently received a new puppy and knew the first thing that she needed to do was to take the puppy out to the yard to use the restroom. She was wrapping the dog in a white towel and walked him outside. She then put the dog down and shook the hair out of the blanket. As she does so, she then noticed the neighbour's son watching her from across the street. The guy's in his late 20s and known for being very strange and mentally ill. He would do really psycho stuff, like skinning the neighbour's cats and hanging them from their clothing line, or killing the neighbour's pigs. My mum said he would always creep her out and everybody else. She said that he would stare at her when she would play outside and made her feel generally uncomfortable. She said that he appeared out of nowhere that day and appeared in the yard. As she was shaking out the blanket, he began grinning and waving. Feeling more than a little shook, she picked up her puppy and went inside and locked the door. She began to do some homework after that. She then heard a loud knock at the door. She slowly walked towards the window to see who it was. She knew it wasn't her grandparents because of course they had keys. As she opens the blinds, her eyes locked with those of the creep from across the street. Like he was already looking into the window. She jumped and was scared. She screamed a little and shut the blinds. She walked to the door and made sure it was locked. She said he just continued with a slow continuous thud on the door, almost like in a rhythm. Then, she got terrified as he began speaking to her through the door, saying, "Hi sweetie, come on, let me in, I just want to see your puppy." In full freaked out mode, my mum screamed, "You need to leave me alone now and go back to your home, I don't know you." He kept on knocking. I can see the fear in my mum's eyes when she describes that part. It gives my whole body chills. He said, "Damn it, let me in. I saw you waving your flag of surrender." So this guy thought that my mum shaking off the hair from the blanket was her surrendering. My mum screamed, "I'm calling my dad and the police if you don't leave now." With this, the knocking stopped. She tried to catch her breath as she was shaken with fear. She then got up from the door and ran to the basement level of the home. She made it to the phone and began to dial 911. All of a sudden, she heard a shatter from the next room. She looked over to see the crazed neighbour attempting to crawl through the kitchen window. He was ripping down the curtain as his upper body got through, and my mother screamed and said what was happening to the police on the phone. All of a sudden, he was bleeding from the abdomen where the glass had cut him as he tried to lower himself through. Then my mum began hearing my grandmother's screams. "What the hell are you doing?" Then the guy yelling out in pain and squirmed out the window as she hit him from behind with some kind of tool that was laying on her garden. He managed to get out of the window and bolted to the house. The police come. My grandma called my grandfather. He come over instantly. Now they arrested him for breaking and entering and something else I believe that was unrelated. Probation violation, I think. On the day of his court date, he told them the white flag of surrender story. This is all they needed to hear to put him in a mental institution on that day. We were climbing a utility shaft behind a lecture hall that ran up the length of the building. At the bottom of the shaft were 2 or 3 boxes filled with these black and white pictures of mannequins. Some were out of focus headshots of faceless mannequins, some were pictures of them in compromising positions, and some were just generic looking shots. After climbing up 3 or 4 stories, we found a mattress and blanket. Now on its own, that would just be sad and curious, but with the pictures, it added a new layer to the creepiness. I'd hate to think what kind of people would live there and what they were doing with them pictures, or where they ended up. I'm into cave exploration. I know it's scary and dangerous, but I get a really big kick out of it, an adrenaline rush. Now I've been in some pretty tight situations and had some scary things happen to me before. Usually it's if you hear an animal near the entrance, or if you get lost. I mean, getting lost can be deadly, but as long as you're calm and know what you're doing, you can find your way out. But something happened to me that I cannot explain, and I could not remain calm during. So one time I was very deep into a cave that I've explored lots of times. I decided to take a route that I haven't before. I got a really weird vibe the moment that I went into this part of the cave. Now within 2 minutes, my light started dimming and went off after a few seconds. I quickly put another battery in and couldn't get it to come back on. As I was standing there, I heard somebody whisper, "I can help you out, buddy." I then did an instant 180 and started sprinting the way that I come from. I got a little lost on the way out, but I was so full of adrenaline that I didn't stop running. I ran all the way home and I've never went cave exploring since. So I'm a 26-year-old male, and I've been planning a camping trip with my wife and dad for an entire year now. I wanted everything to be perfect, as we don't get to go away from town much and dive deep into the woods as much as I'd like to. So this story takes place in the very tree-dense Davy Crockett National Forest in East Texas. Earlier that day, my dad decided to go a little early and pick out a good camping spot for us. To give a layout of where we camped, there were 2 dirt roads on either side of us and an overlook to the north of us. We camped in the middle, between the 2 roads. My wife and I arrived and met my dad downtown there around 11 AM. We set up camp and proceeded to enjoy the day until around dinner time, when we started to cook our meal for the evening. Right as we both got done with our dinner, we see this truck circling around our campsite. He went around several times and finally pulled up right into the camp and got out of his truck. He then proceeded to tell us that this was his family's campsite, and how the firewood that was laying around was his. Now in this particular forest, campsites are first come first serve. My dad's been there since 9 AM. This guy then asked if he could camp with us. He wanted to camp right next to us. Of course, being friendly, we said sure. We didn't know what he meant when he said next to us, so he meant directly on top of us. He backed his camper in so close to our tents that it actually blocked my truck in. We weren't sure why he was doing this. There's so many other spots available, but we just shrugged it off and tried to have a good time anyway. Not too long after that, we noticed a white Dodge circling around us. We had an off feeling from this truck because it went around several times, but we dismissed it because the area that we're in is very popular due to the overlook. After a long night of drinking and goofing off, we finally decide to head to bed. I was in a dead sleep when, out of the woods, I wake up to a blood-curdling scream. I jolt my wife awake and say, "What the hell was that?" About 30 seconds later, we hear another scream off in the distance. At this point, I grab my gun and unzip the tent so we could see out. My dad had left a lantern burning so we could actually see a little way into our campsite. At that moment, we see the white Dodge tearing down the campsite behind us. They continue down the road until they're out of sight. We heard them get out of their truck, slam the doors and scream. They then proceeded to get back in their truck and drive very slowly down the road that was in front of our campsite. At this point, we're terrified thinking that they're coming to rob us, but they actually kept on driving until they're far out of sight. We then heard gunshots. After the gunshots ended, they sped off. At this point we thought that they must have been up to something, but were worried to call the cops in case they come back for us at that time. We tried to go back to sleep. The next day, we had to make a beer run for my dad. When we made it out to the camping area and onto the main highway, there were police everywhere. They had stopped two young boys, who they assumed were being troublemakers from the night before. When we got back to our campsite, the cops were leaving after talking to my dad. They told me that the guy in the white dolly had gone into these young guys' camp while they're out hunting and robbed them. The boys walked up to their camp being robbed, and the dolly guys actually pulled out guns, proceeding to rob the young boys at gunpoint. Now we think that if we weren't there at the time, they probably would have killed them because we were their only witness. It's not work, but one of my hobbies is model railroading. Some years ago, back in the late 90s, I took to building a model railroad based around a small short log-in/lumber railroad which existed in the northeast part of Georgia. The railroad itself had gone belly up sometime in the mid-40s during World War II, with the majority of the sawmill buildings and tracks being pulled up for scrap metal. What wasn't pulled up had been left to rot. Lots of the cars and vehicles used were just made out of wood. I didn't expect to find much. About 2 hours into mapping and bridge locations, I came to this branch line which was curved off the main. The branch wasn't on any of the maps I had, some of which actually dated back to the 1900s when the line was built, so naturally I become curious. While going along, I noticed that the rails were still in place, and it was badly grown up and lots of tyres were rotten everywhere. It looked generally good though, not half bad condition considering how old it was. About 1.5 miles down this branch, as I come up a group of trees, I then come face to face with this old locomotive. Now the thing looks like it had been there for years, at least 50 if not more. It was battered, severely damaged from wildfires that run through the area from time to time. I took several photos of it and headed home. The next day, I went down to a local railway historian society to ask them if they knew about it. Here's where things get weird. Speaking with them, I was told that they had only heard about it and wondered if I'd marked on the map where it was. I showed them and they got the photos developed. Not a single one I took actually showed the locomotive in it. Those taken before it, they're all fine, but every single one of the engine and any parts of the train were just not exposed at all. The Historical Society never found the locomotive, and I, over the course of multiple years, kept looking for it. Trying as I might, I never found it again, even following the same railroad as I had before. It was almost as if it hadn't existed before. Back in 9th grade, I had unwillingly befriended somebody I really wanted to avoid. Let me start off with some background information. I don't know if it's like this for all schools, but basically, were assigned a school based on what zone we lived in. During my middle school years, we moved and I was supposed to change schools, but I was given the chance to stay as long as I went to the proper high school later. Now I tried out for these specific scientific classes and made it in. One of the big things for this class was team building, so it was pretty much tradition that every year there was a mini camping trip to get to know our peers. I remembered very well that everybody had already known each other since they'd come from the same high school. When the trip day arrived, my classmate scrambled onto the bus and I hung back. By the time I worked up the courage to enter, there was only one more seat available. Everyone avoided it. Looking back now, I realised it was because of him. I sat down and there was a boy, short and thin, totally non-threatening. He seemed relieved that somebody had sat next to him for a while, but he didn't say anything. An hour later, he finally decided to try and talk to me. It was small talk, slightly forced on my end, simply because talking to new people makes me uncomfortable. Now after a while with this, I eventually fell asleep, and I woke up to him leaning on me. I pushed him off and nothing more was said. Sometime later we got off and went to camp. I began to notice that he'd follow me. If I did any camp activities, he was by my side at all times. It was difficult for me to make friends with this weird guy following me everywhere. I finally had connected with a few other girls though and stuck mostly by them. One event that struck me as odd though was when we went swimming in the lake. We wanted to go into the shower afterwards, but he wanted to join us. We told him not to, and as we walked, he trailed behind us. We actually began pleading for him to just go away. It took a teacher to catch up on our conversation to make him leave. Now after this trip, there were a few things that stuck out from his creepy mannerisms. He clung to our group of girls and despite our annoyance, we didn't want to be cruel and send somebody away that was clearly mentally ill. I remembered one time I was inviting them over for a sleepover and he was angry that he wasn't allowed to come, stating that I was sexist. In fact, whenever I showed any interest to any other person, he would purposely ruin anything. He was heavily jealous of my brother. Now there was one event that was really the last straw. It was morning time before classes started, so I waited in the cafeteria with some friends. He came up to me with a lot of purpose in his step and asked me to come with him somewhere. I didn't know where, but I didn't want to go and flat out refused. His response? He marched around the table for 7 minutes, no pauses, nothing. It literally took another student to tell him to leave me alone. That student then told me that he had done it to her before. I was shocked, honestly. She told me that it would only get worse if we didn't stop him in his tracks, so that's what I had to do. I told him to leave me alone, and if he didn't, I was going to report him for harassment. It wasn't over though. I don't recall any creepy behaviour happening in 10th grade, but then this year marched in. I was kicked out of the special science class and placed in CP Algebra 2 class. I walked in and who do I see? Him. He stares at me and smiles. I sat down a couple of rows away from him. Now the first week passes with no problems. He interjects in class a lot and corrects a teacher, but nothing to me. Then I heard him talking to himself, whispering. Now when he got called out by a student for doing so, they joked about it and all was well it seemed. He said nothing else audible to me, and then he got a bit louder, intending for me to hear it. That he was going to get his revenge on the people that wronged him, and a sinister smile come across his face. Now eventually he got suspended and I moved out of the maths class straight away. I don't know what revenge he had planned for me or whatever come of him. I just hope that he never got his revenge and never hurt anyone. This experience still gives me chills to this day. I've actually had a few other camp encounters that I can share here if anybody's interested. But anyway, a few years ago, I worked at a Jewish summer camp in North Georgia, As many of you may know, Georgia is a fairly conservative state, as well as being predominantly Christian. There are small Jewish communities and a few summer camps. I'd say this camp was more culturally Jewish than it was religious. I mean, there were no religious requirements for non-religion specific focus. Rather, it was a place for kids who were often in the military to come to camp for a while. Staff would actually come from all over the world. Lots of Australians, lots of British people, and a few Israelis, and people from various areas of the USA. Each night at around 10, most of the staff were able to get out of town for a couple of hours. Enough staff remained behind to watch over the cabins though. We did a rotation. This particular night, a group of about 5 of us decided to go to a local bar to grab a few beers. It had been a hot day and was humid at night, so we decided to sit outside on the patio. For some backstory on the town, generally, we were extremely well received by the community, despite our differences. We brought in lots of revenue for the town during summer. We bought supplies at the local Walmarts and often took campers onto tubing trips, or occasionally out to dinner, or for a long hike on the Appalachian Trail. It was midsummer, so we'd been out to the bars in many areas. So 5 of us sat around a table, drinking and discussing the events of the day, as fellow employees typically would do after work. About 30 minutes in, a white man in his 20s come up to our table. I distinctly remembered a jagged scar on his cheek, but I didn't think too much of it. He introduces himself, then told us that he was having a party that night at his place. "Anyone can come," he said. Black, white, gay, straight. I found it pretty odd that he had opened his speech with that disclaimer. Of course, the party should be open to everyone. Why did he have to put that disclaimer at the start? But we'd all had a few beers and were feeling pretty loose. He talked for a bit longer. Nothing seemed really off. We told him that we were working at the camp in the area and couldn't stay out, so we'd probably be heading back soon. An hour later, our group went out to the parking lot to get into the cars. As we approached, we saw the same guy come out of the shadows. He had a buddy with him this time with a shaved head. His expression was incredibly hateful. His eyes had changed. He pounded his fist into his hand. He took his shirt off and revealed a poorly inked SS tattoo. My stomach dropped. One of the bigger guys in my group, Calvin, immediately reacted by pulling out a knife from his back pocket and asked what he wanted. The original guy started shouting some anti-Semitic remarks and told us that he was going to beat us down. Kevin started walking towards the 2 guys, but we pulled him back. He told us his buddies were on the way. Sure enough, some more guys started walking into the parking lot. It's all kind of blurry here. I remember jumping into one of the cars, pulling Calvin with us. It felt like we were surrounded, though there was probably only 7 or 8 of them. Rocks were thrown at the car. We sped off. My heart was pounding like crazy. We never went back to that bar again.
I grew up with a very outdoorsy family. We always went camping and hiking in the summer. My mother told this story to my sister and I about a time she went camping with my dad before we were born. I was in my tent, and it was the middle of the night, perhaps 1 a.m., and I had woken up to go pee, just like normal. I was about to unzip the tent when I heard a small scratching sound. I paused. It was a slow, deliberate, crunchy digging kind of sound. It was too rhythmic for an animal, so after making sure it wasn't your father who was sharing the tent, I unzipped a corner of the door and peeked out. The moon was just bright enough for me to see a young woman squatting next to our little 2-man tent, digging at the ground with her bare hands. Even your father was scared. so he went and shined a flashlight on her and told her to go back to wherever she had made camp. The woman got up silently, leaving a 4-inch deep hole next to the tent, and started walking away. I went outside, went pee, and got back into my sleeping bag. A few minutes later, I was awoken again by a clattering sound of a person or animal walking around where we had put our stuff. I looked outside again, and the woman was crouched low, walking around our stuff and looking at things the way a monkey might. Your father stepped out of the tent, shined the flashlight on her again, and she faced him. He asked her to kindly leave our stuff alone, but she just stood there, dirty and neglected looking, but clearly not malnourished, staring at his light. He gave up and went back into our tent. Soon we heard her digging again at her little hole, which was literally 6 inches and 2 pieces of thin nylon away from my head. I shouted for her to go away, and she ran away in an animalistic kind of way and never returned. I fell back asleep, and in the morning our stuff was scattered, but nothing was stolen.
Often mentioned to be one of the most dangerous jobs in America, being a delivery driver definitely has its pros and cons. Aside from the horror stories you hear of drivers being called to abandoned homes with malicious intent, being stabbed or even shot, I have no doubt in my mind that I wanted to try out being a delivery driver. My reasoning was led by the fact that it would be decent money for a college student, and I would get to do what I genuinely enjoyed doing, driving around blasting music and whatnot. Now, I don't think much about dangers, but I must have been subconsciously realizing that the area I was going to be delivering in was very wealthy, and a lot of business was there with little crime. My sophomore year of college was over. I'd left my previous job to focus on my main heavy course, and this was very helpful for doing so taking this job. I was hired at the first and only place that I actually applied for. Now for this job, I was taking about a 30-minute commute from my home, and I would be driving in a town and city that I had previously had no familiarity with. Besides the nervousness of trying to impress at the start of my new job, I was excited to get started and get in my car. I must note that I was never warned of anything or told anything to do in alarming situations by any of the management or other drivers. That's because there were no scary or bad situations that happened until I landed the delivery shift 6 months later that would traumatize me and force changes in the policy for this company. So it was a normal night per usual, and I was on a delivery to a neighbouring city about 15 minutes out. There was a confusing numbering system on the small apartment complexes that occupied the left side of the road. I had believed that my GPS took me to the right lot, but when I'd pulled in, I could not seem to find the apartment number listed. A nice guy was walking his dog, so I politely asked him which one was 22 Street whatever, and he responded talkatively. He said no sadly, and then realizes how confusing these streets can be. Before I get a chance to ask if he knows what direction to send me in, he quickly asked an assortment of questions which made me uncomfortable. He saw I was delivering food and said, "What food is it?" I had not put the light on the top of the car, so it made sense that he was curious. Not a crazy amount of places deliver around here. He then got oddly excited, asking if I had a menu, what time we deliver until, and if I'm the only one delivering on this Sunday night. After quickly answering these questions, I asked if he could point me to the way I needed to go, because I had to be back in a rush. He said he isn't too sure, but insisted to walk his dog up to the road while I would drive out so he could help me figure it out. After a minute or two of navigating, he said where to try next. I thanked him, smiled and told him to feel free to call our delivery, and I'll be back out with your food in no time. I said this because he said he was starving, asked for a menu, and seemed excited about the fact that we delivered. As nightfall come close, I was hoping that I didn't get any more delivery calls after 9:15. Delivery shut down at 9:30, but if a call was placed anywhere before that, I would be stuck driving and not get out till at least 10. At this point I'm on autopilot, just following my GPS, not paying attention to where I'm going. As I recognise a similar street which I had only turned on the first time today, I hear my GPS say turn left in 2 miles. I realised it has to be the guy that helped me out earlier. I pulled in, park, approach the door and knock. I hear faint music that seems to have gotten louder after I knocked, so I ring the doorbell again. I'm greeted by the friendly man, both of us smiling at each other. "I guess you decided cooking wasn't good for you tonight," I said lightheartedly. He said something along the lines of, "Cooking isn't something I waste my time on. I believe raw food is the most authentic way to feast." I laughed, thinking to myself that this guy's definitely an odd one. He then tells me that I can go into the kitchen to put the bags down. Most of the time, I don't go into customers' homes, but it wasn't so uncommon. I promptly step in, and he says, "Take your shoes off." Now that makes me uncomfortable. Never have I been told to do so while doing a delivery. It doesn't make sense. This is an in and out job. I'm not going to sit here and put my feet up. I figured that this guy has some OCD or other issues. I slipped my shoes off. This moment seemed like it is in slow motion and lasts longer than it did. My eyes fixed on this strange runner / small carpet next to a shoe rack that was made of what seemed to be black feathers. Simultaneously, I am listening to the song he was playing, which gave me a sense of extreme discomfort and anxiety. I followed him to the counter and placed the bags down, next to what looked to be a stuffed crow. Weirdly enough, this was placed into a nativity scene. He seemed to be explaining it, and says, "Did you know that when a crow dies, a mob of 100 actually come and will gather in the cemetery? It's their way to learn about threats, and they hesitate to revisit locations when they've encountered a dead crow." So I pulled out the payment slip for him to sign and shook off the previous statements as interesting. As he signs and continues the subject and says about how he thinks that we can learn a lot about how these crows are, and smiles a bit. I thanked him for signing. As I moved out, I said to him, "That's interesting. I'll look that up." As I'm putting my shoes back on, he says, "Oh, one last thing. If I said somebody was killed here, would you hesitate to come back? If I said I was responsible, would you revisit this location?" I panicked and sped out, and fled to work with these thoughts rushing through my head. A couple of sleepless nights after that, and 5 months later, this still continues to haunt me. Looking back, I should have called the police at what he said. The situation I got myself in was very dangerous, but also my fault for actually stepping in and talking to him.
A little background before we get into this. I am currently an 18-year-old senior in high school and college-bound next year. The events of this story are true, and I will leave a link below to the article. I remember my middle school years as some of the best and worst of my life. I didn't adjust well to 6th grade and spent a lot of my time grounded due to poor grades. Despite this, my 7th grade year I remember being much more enjoyable. I don't remember much about the first week of school, except for the creepy feeling of walking into 7th period science class. The classroom was an outside portable disconnected from the rest of the school, and was all the way in the back of the other portables. The teacher, well, I call him Mr. Smith, had this odd, almost Jeffrey Dahmer look to him. He was always dressed well and did not seem intimidating. Just something about the way he talked while completely still and having a slight smirk on his face would give me and other students the creeps. Other than this, I had no problems. I even started talking to Mr. Smith, not just about assignments, but personal things as well. He brought up his daughter. We will call her Anna. I remembered her as I was in the same class as her every year of elementary school, and we even became good friends until the end of 5th grade. His son was much younger and would sometimes stay with him till school let out. The elementary school was right next to my middle school and let out about 2 hours before us. The year went on and the class soon became a favorite of mine. We would do studies of plate tectonics, animal populations, things like that. I always found myself talking to Mr. Smith. I genuinely felt like I trusted him and that he would be one of the most memorable teachers I would have. One of these turned out, unfortunately for me, to be very true. Fast forward to now, my senior year in high school. A few months before the time of me writing this, I was working a dinner shift after school with a friend of mine I knew from my junior year. He says to me, "Did you hear about Mr. Smith?" I remembered my 7th grade year and responded, "No, what about him?" My friend looked at me and said, "He's being out on trial for murder. They're saying he killed his wife." The shock set in, and I immediately looked it up. Sure as shit, I found it. Middle school teacher on trial for murder of young wife. I read into and found out that he and his family had moved to Montana, where Mr. Smith became divorced. That night, I hardly slept, thinking of all the times I had talked to that man. I always knew there was something off about my 7th science teacher.
I was about 15 when I got my first real job in West New York, NJ. My mum had sent me to live with my sister, who is 13 years older than me, and she and I had recently gotten into a massive argument, so much so that we hadn't spoken to each other in over a week. Because of the argument, I ended up taking the bus to work. This place had a lot of people coming in and out. I served coffee and pastries to the customers. I just moved to NJ from Florida. I've always been a relatively nice person, smiley and conversationally friendly. Well, apparently, I left a huge impression on some man who hung around during the daytime to talk to me and just generally waited for me to get off. Again, I was about 16 and he was probably in his 40s. So I kept on working, and as the hours passed, he would come and go, always checking to see if I was almost done. I specifically remembered him asking questions about when I was getting off. Do I live close by? He was picking me up, but he seemed to be friendly enough, so I just kept small talk throughout the day. I had a relatively short shift since I was so young, but when my time came to clock out, I tried to leave without making a big deal about it. This guy was keeping a clear eye on me the whole time. He then starts following me throughout the entire establishment. He wants to accompany me to my bus. He wants to be sure that I'm okay. He starts grabbing me by the arm and telling me to come with him. He basically stalked me the entire day, and now was his chance to make his move. At this point, I'm pretty scared, and since this was back before I had a cell phone or texting was around, I didn't have any way to call for help. I hadn't made it far from my real job. I was still in the parking lot and like a bat out of hell. My sister came speeding into the parking lot mad as hell. When she saw this guy pulling up on me, she even got more mad. Of course she yelled at me. She said, "Get the hell in the car," She then looked at the guy and started screaming at him. Obviously he was about to abduct me. He then got the hell out of there. She said, "What were you doing with him, etc." I told her everything that happened and she gave me a hug and we both started crying. Till this day, this is a part that we both couldn't understand, but she told me that as she was coming home from work that day, she had a nagging sensation to pick me up from work. She didn't know I was working, but she felt a sensation that she needed to pick me up. I worked about a good 20 or 30 minutes away from our home. She's never had this sensation before, and never had anything like it since.
Okay, so this happened in Maine when I was about 3 years old, almost 4. I was at the beach with my mom. We went as a group, with some others stay at home, moms and their kids. It was a fairly hot and crowded day there, and I found myself playing with the other kids at the edge of the water. For some reason, I strayed away a bit, and that's when a middle-aged woman started talking to me. I remember her very clearly. She looked like a mother would, with a one-piece black bathing suit, cargo shorts, sunglasses, and her hair pulled up in a bun. She asked me what games I liked to play and what my favorite candy was. As soon as I told her, I believe I said Tootsie Pops. She told me she had some in her car and persuaded me to come with her. Yes, I know, I was quite the naive child. She was cheerful and enthusiastic, taking my hand and leading me away through the crowded beach. I skipped alongside her and had no fear whatsoever. Then, thank my lucky stars, my mom spotted me from a distance and started screaming my name at the top of her lungs and jumping up and down while waving her arms. The woman immediately let go of my hand and darted away. I just stood there, terribly confused, until my mom got to me. I get chills thinking about it now. She seemed so nice at the time, though I admit I was way too trusting. It stinks of an attempted kidnapping now. If my mom had not have spotted me, who knows where I would be, or if I would even be alive.
I was 13 years old at the time. I'm now 22 and on vacation with my parents in Turkey. We were enjoying an all-inclusive hotel and enjoying the holiday. The hotel was full of tourists from different countries. There was one guy, around 20, who was staring at me for some time. I felt uncomfortable. I asked him what he was doing. Bad choice. The next few days, everywhere I was, he would suddenly appear. Not flirting, just lurking for hours, literally watching me. He had a really strange vibe around him, and I felt that I shouldn't be alone with him. Now I was still young, so my parents didn't want to leave me alone in a foreign country, so he couldn't bother me. One night there was entertainment at the hotel, which became boring to me after some time. I told my parents I wanted to go to my own hotel room, and I could see them in the morning. I left and walked to the elevator. What I didn't know was that this guy was watching me. He'd been watching me for days and actually saw when I'd left places and could follow the routine I did. When I saw him also coming in, I was in great fear. He looked at me silently with a sinister smile. This is it, I thought. Something terrible was going to happen. Just before the doors of the elevator were closing, somebody stuck their boots between the door in order to prevent the doors from closing. The doors opened and it was my dad. He saw the creepy guy was leaving at the exact same time that I did and didn't trust it. He looked the guy dead in the eye and said hello. My dad took me to my hotel room. To this day, I'm glad as hell that I had my dad there. God knows what would have happened otherwise.
One evening, when I was 16, I had taken my dog Tex to a park near my house. Tex is technically my dad's dog. My dad worked as a cop in our city, and Tex, a German Shepherd, worked with him as a police dog. We had been there for about 2 hours, and it had started to get dark, so I got Tex on his leash and we headed for home. Our house was a few blocks away, and by the time we left the park, it had gotten dark. It was a Sunday night, so it was pretty quiet, until I started to hear a noise behind me. I looked over my shoulder, and across the street, heading in the opposite direction, was a man. He was dressed in an old Hawaiian shirt with old cargo pants and sneakers. He looked like he might have been about 50 or 60 and was totally bald. The strangest part of the whole scene was that he was dragging a rake behind him. This was the noise I heard. It was an old metal rake, and it was scraping on the pavement behind him. The other weird thing was how Tex reacted. He's always serious when he's on patrol with my dad, but he's normally a marshmallow when he's at home. When he noticed this guy though, his hackles went right up, his ears went down, and he started to growl. The guy stopped under a streetlight and turned to look at us. He just stared at us for a few minutes, so I tugged on Tex's leash and we kept walking. After a few minutes, I turned and looked over my shoulder again. The guy was still staring at us before he suddenly dropped his rake and started running right at us. Tex started barking as loud as he could, trying to get at the guy, while I tried to pull him in the other direction. The guy had stopped when he saw Tex and just stood in the middle of the road. I was dragging Tex away, while the guy continued to just stare. After a few minutes, he went back to get his rake, but this time he started to follow us. He was walking normally, not hurrying or anything, but still following me, dragging his rake behind him. We finally made it to my house, and I told my dad what was happening. When I gave him the description of the guy, he calmly told me to wait in the room and went to make a phone call. My room looks out over the street, and I looked out of my window to see the guy standing in the middle of our driveway. I could hear Tex barking downstairs in the hall, and in the distance I could hear sirens. As I looked down, I noticed that the guy had what looked like paint on his shirt front. I guess I had not noticed it while I was trying to get away. Suddenly, he looked up and noticed me at the window. He stood there, looking at me, and it occurred to me that he wasn't showing any emotion at all. The entire time he'd been walking, running at me and following me, he had always had an emotionless, almost bored face. He stood there, just staring at me. The police sirens got closer, and 3 cars finally pulled up to our house. 3 of the police grabbed the guy, and he went with them calmly into one of these cars. I came downstairs and explained to the police and my parents what had happened. It turns out that the guy was not from our neighborhood, but lived in the city. He had been diagnosed with severe mental issues and must have forgotten to take any of his medications. The police think he'd gotten on a bus with no real destination in mind, and when he got off, just grabbed a rake from someone's yard while he was walking. The paint I had seen was actually blood from someone he met about an hour before me, and he'd just beaten the person up with the rake before continuing on. My dad told me I was lucky I had Tex with me, as he'd clearly deterred the guy from getting too close. I don't go out much after dark now, and when I do, I always make sure I'm either with other people or have Tex nearby.
Growing up in relatively rural Ireland in the 90s, there wasn't much to do other than going to the local park to play. I was around 8 or 9 years old on this day. My cousin was with me. She was a few months younger. We were walking along the huge green that led to the park to play with some other kids from the neighbourhood. One of them was Brendan. Looking back now, Brendan had a learning disability, but at the time, I just thought he was slower because he was a bit younger than us. The park and green ran alongside a road in the middle of homes, and my grandparents and at least half a dozen of my aunts and uncles lived less than 2 miles away. I always felt safe there. As we were walking along, a van pulled up to us very quickly. The sliding door was already open and there were girls inside. I'd say they looked to be around 18. They had this forced grin on their faces. I stopped dead in my tracks. I had this sinking gut feeling. All the things my mum told me about kidnappings were going off like alarm bells in my head. One of the girls asked, "Do you want to have a lift to the village?" My cousin and I looked at each other. I could feel she was scared. We started to back away, but she continues towards us. "It's okay. I think I know your sister. I'm gonna meet her now. Hop in. We'll take you away." I turned around and ran. She was so weird and frightening, and her attempt to act casual was disturbing. I looked around at Brendan, and he was standing still with his arms out. The girl was trying to usher him in still. "Brandon, don't go with them," I said. The girls heard his name and kept saying, "Brandon, come with us, I'll take you to your mum's house." After a few minutes of deliberation, another car came around the bend, and the van sped off very quickly. Since then, I've always wondered who the hell those girls were. Why were they so young themselves, and who was driving the van? Would Brendan have actually gotten in with them? And what would have happened had there only have been one of us at the time, more isolated? One of the creepiest things that ever happened to me was when I was camping during the winter time. Now I live in a state that gets a lot of snow, and I'm used to the cold, so that means that I'm also used to struggling to make fires. So this one time, I realised that my fire went out during night. I woke up and noticed how immediately cold it was. Now the second that I stepped out of my tent, it was too dark. Now I know the fire wasn't going, so that's the reason for it. But I mean, it was darker than dark, if that makes sense. I couldn't really see any of the stars above me. I thought, okay, I haven't been awake for very long. My eyes are not adjusting well. So I used my torch and navigated over to where my campfire was. I flipped out my lighter and got some tinder going again. Just as I did so, my torch went out. At that exact moment, I heard whispering in a foreign language around me. Now I thought to myself, God, I really do need to get back to sleep. My mind is really playing tricks on me. Just as I was doing so, I felt a warmth come over me. It was in good contrast to the weird presence I was feeling at the time. I then noticed it as a little bit too bright. I thought my eyes were adjusting, but as I looked over, I could see that my entire tent was going up in flames. I noped the hell out of there. I grabbed my stuff immediately around me and began trekking all the way back, and did so until daybreak. I haven't been camping since.
My mom owns her own business and works extremely hard. This means she spends many late nights sitting on the living room floor with her work sprawled out around her. One night, back in 2003, she had her typical routine going, sorting through paperwork and making piles. It was late, close to midnight on a Wednesday, so when the phone rang, she was a bit surprised. My dad worked third shift at a factory, so she assumed it was him. When she answered the phone, there was no reply, just lots of heavy breathing. Admittedly creeped out, she hung up and called my dad. He told her he hasn't called, and she left it at that. Keep in mind, This was almost 15 years ago, and we lived in a small town with practically no crime. We never locked our doors and were never scared of dangerous people. But the phone calls kept coming. Every night, multiple times at night, and the person on the other end started talking. He started by saying, "Hello Diane, you're so beautiful. I'd love to meet you," and things quickly escalated into him going into graphic detail of how he wanted to rape and strangle her. Of course, she stopped answering the phone and she informed the police, but nothing was ever done, and the phone would continue to ring. My parents weren't in the situation where my dad could stay home from work, and my mom truly believed the calls were just empty threats, so things continued on. Until one night, he got brave. My mom was sitting on the floor, in front of our huge mirrored cabinet, with all her work around her when the phone rang. She ignored it as usual. She was concentrating hard on a piece of paper in front of her when a glimmer of light in the mirror caught her eye. She looked up to see a pair of eyeglasses peering at her in the reflection. She spun around to face the front door, which her back had been turned to, and a man was standing there staring at her. She said they both just stared at each other for what felt like forever, until she saw the doorknob turn. She started screaming and the man quickly ran away. In light of the phone calls, my parents had started locking all the doors, which was a totally foreign concept to our household. My older brother, who was about 17 at the time and was aware of the phone calls, came running down the stairs with a baseball bat, but the man was long gone. When the police came, they scoured our property and came across close to 200 cigarette butts right underneath our living room windows, hidden behind bushes. He had been watching her for weeks. The police also happened to find a bike tire trail coming from the windows and going down the sidewalk. They took the cigarette butts and did DNA testing on them and were able to match them to a convicted rapist who lived down the street from us. Robert Ham was arrested while riding his bike. He went to prison for menacing and attempt to commit a crime. He had many priors, so we assumed he would be locked up for quite some time. The reason I'm telling this story is because he was released from prison earlier this year.
Thank you for watching. I want to say a massive thank you to Creeks and Peaks for featuring on this video. She has a very good narrating voice and a very good channel, so I strongly recommend you subscribe to her. We're also doing some more collaborations in the future, and I'll be featuring on her channel, so stay posted for that. So thank you to her, and thank you for watching again. I work part-time for my university's IT department. I manage the public computer sites, fixing machines when they're broken, handle scheduling of other consultants, etc. I'm mostly on call all the time, and during a summer weekend, there's not much to expect except to get paid. The campus library is across the hall from my office. Normally, it is open, even on weekends, but it was closed for the intersession this weekend before the semester begins. Lights off, doors locked. There's no way to get in unless you have a swipe access card, which I do. There are computers in there. So I'm in my office passing time on the internet when I hear a bit of a racket. I peek out the door and there's this bigger man, probably about 40, tugging on the doors trying to rip them open. He doesn't notice me come out and asks, more like yells, "When is this place open?" I pointed to the hours sign and explained that it would be open on Monday when the classes begin. He walks away and seems unsatisfied with the answer. More time passes. Out of boredom, I decided to go check out the library. Now, I've only ever been in there once before while it was shut. I swipe my card and go in. It's really creepy in that place when it's shut. I wasn't supposed to be there. If I got caught, I'd probably be in some trouble. I really didn't have permission or reason to go there, especially not in another department during the closing hours. All the lights are off except, with the only light coming through the windows. This place is huge. You can hear ventilation fans clicking on and off. As I began creeping past some of the rows and aisles, the locked door study doors start creaking and occasionally make noises as if somebody's inside them. Now by this point, the library's been closed for almost 24 hours at this point, and no one likely camped out in there. It's just noises. Still, as I walk alone in this place, it feels like I'm not alone. I go to the lounge area and sit down, but I feel uncomfortable with the dark silence and get up soon. I walk to the bathroom. As soon as I walk in, I notice there's somebody in the stall. All I can see is one foot at first glance from underneath the door. One naked foot, no shoes or socks, in a public restroom. One bloody foot, and there's a small pool of blood on the floor in the stall. I froze and immediately tightened up. I was really startled because nobody is supposed to be in there. Second, there's a bloody foot. I didn't see any sort of socks or shoes around, no pants around or anything. I didn't even see a second foot, just a pale, cold white foot, large too. The store is partially open, but not enough that I could see inside from my angle. I say with a shaken voice, "Hello?" No response, nothing happens. I wonder if there's even a body attached to the fort. I wonder if there's a dead body inside. I then ask, "What are you doing, man?" The toes then curl up and relax. I promptly turn right out to go towards the door and walk out of the library. I go back into my office as I try to make sense of what I just seen. Should I call campus cops? The thing is, I really didn't want to get any of the paperwork on my hands, questions with the police, etc. I justified that I wasn't supposed to be over there anyway, and I was going to have to lie about why I was there. Instead, I called my friend on the phone. I just wanted to talk to somebody. I felt so uneasy. Now Andy and I talked for a good 40 minutes. Most of it just like, wow, that's messed up, and no startling discoveries. Heavily considering calling the police now, but so much time had passed that I assumed the person would be gone, and also, this person certainly appeared to be on their own. I decided to go back and stay on the phone with Andy. I know how stupid this is. If somebody is hurting themselves, they may not care much about hurting me either. They're probably very unstable, and they have some kind of blade or knife on them. I'm not in any mood to get into a knife fight here during my shift. I want to check out the bathroom again. As I walk through the library, it's worse this time, because now I'm not alone. There's somebody here, probably with a weapon. It's still dead silent and dark at this point. I softly walk into the bathroom and listen outside the door for a moment. I don't hear any sounds, but I get chills. Andy's on the speakerphone. He's also staying silent. I go inside. The foot is still there. There's more blood than before. Cold and pale looking. The doors are now shut. That's the only other change that's happened in the last 40 minutes. I was really hoping not to see anybody in here this time. I don't want to anger a possibly suicidal person. I ask, "You alright?" No response. Only blood. I repeat, "Are you alright there? Have I got a call for help?" Slowly, the foot turns and points towards me. A second foot steps down alongside it. Whatever is inside the stall is now standing and facing directly at me, with only a wall between us. I can't see the top of any head. My heart starts racing. Finally, a deep voice responds with, "I'm fine." This is a good enough reason for me to turn around and leave. I told myself before going in here that if he was still there, I'd call the cops. I didn't. He was fine. I wanted to put this thought through my head and forget it. The voice sounded like an older man, I guess 30 or 50. The size of the feet made him seem really big, but not that tall. It's hard to say really. I lock the door to my office and do nothing for the last 30 minutes or so of my shift. When I step out into the hallway, there are bloody footmarks walking out of the library and over to my office door. There's actually plenty of them outside my door. It was pacing and standing there for a while. Small drips of blood leading away from the door and stopping after a small distance. I was absolutely horrified. I hurried back to my truck. I paused for a moment and realised with the amount of blood outside my office door in the hallway, I just can't leave. I'd probably be asked about it anyway. I should just call it in. I then head back up, and to my horror, I find that all the footprints are gone. All of the bloody prints have been moved away. All the blood smears are there though. It's not a perfectly good cleaning job, but I was only gone for maybe 5 or 10 minutes. Whatever it was is still hanging around, watching me, cleaning up after itself too. I'm very scared. I go back to my truck. There's a bloody towel on my door handle. This person is seriously trying to mess with me. I hurry right over to the campus police. I'm just going to tell them the whole story, even the fact that I was trespassing, and that I went back for a second visit instead of calling the cops. And I did. I told them all. They took pictures of my car and told me that they're going to look into it. They returned to the library, requested that I didn't accompany them inside. I went home. This was over 2 days ago now. I haven't heard anything since. This happened months ago, but I can remember everything that happened as clear as day. I worked at a Pendra bread restaurant and had a bread bash, which is sort of a meeting for all employees to update the menu and such. I had a shift that ended at night, but I finished everything up early and waited out in the lobby with my friend. It was a while until the meeting actually began, so my friend and I decided to go grab a coffee at the nearest Starbucks. We actually get in and out of the Starbucks pretty quickly, and begin walking back to my car when I notice a man staring at us from the next parking lot over. Thinking nothing of it, we take our time to get into our car when I notice he starts running towards us. I tell my friend quickly to get in the car. Now both of us are females and we can't really trust random men. I just close my door as he catches up to us looking swiftly. I suppose he didn't notice how fast we got inside, or how quickly the car locks up, so he quickly knocks on my window trying to open the door. I was already looking up at him. He then said to me that I had to roll the window down, but I motioned to my ear and said that I can't hear him. He says he needs a ride and points past the Starbucks to the right. Luckily, I was telling the truth and informed him we have a meeting at our work. It's the opposite way. He then said to me that, "Oh, it's okay, you're not going to be much later, just let me in." I tell him no. It's too dangerous, I'm not going to let a stranger into my car. Now on the way back, my friend asked me why I didn't let him in since our meeting didn't start for another 20 minutes or so, but I simply told her that, no, I'm never going to let a stranger go for a ride. This shuts her up. Well, after the meeting was finishing up, I remembered it takes about 20 minutes to get home and my car would not make it back, so I asked a few of my friends if they needed to fill up their cars since I absolutely hated going to the gas station alone at night. Unfortunately, they all said no, and I decided to tough it out and go across the street to the Sphinx. I parked at pump number 7 and grabbed cash to go inside. Once I'm inside, I grab a bag of chips before getting ready to pay gas when I look up and make eye contact with someone familiar. It's a stranger from earlier who wanted a ride. I know it's the same person because he was a skinny white male that appeared to be anywhere from his late 20s to early 30s with messy brown hair and a patchy beard. He also had a baggy brown hoodie on and baggy jeans. I felt my heart beat faster after seeing him exit the store. I then paid for my stuff and stand around a few other people as I peer outside. The stranger was standing around my car for a solid few minutes before walking away. Once I saw no sign of him, I walked out behind a very large man and made my way towards my car. I'm $6 into pumping gas in my car, and I look over towards the buildings and see the stranger push off from the wall and beginning to walk straight over to me. He throws a cigarette on the ground during the process. I swear gas never pumped so slowly in my life. I realise that there's no way to physically make the gas pump any quicker, so I put my keys between my knuckles. He looks at me. I give him an uncomfortable half smile. He then asks me if he knows me from somewhere, and I pretend to examine him as if he was familiar but shook my head. He then asks me what my real name is. What he said next makes my skin crawl. Well, Valerie, I need a ride over there and you're the prettiest one here, so I was wondering maybe you could give me a ride over there. As he said this, he was pointing to his right again, which made me wonder why he decided to go even further from his desired destination, and why he was not just simply able to walk over there the whole time. I told him that my parents needed me home since it was a school night and it's already late, but he reached a hand out for me, and I was slowly pumping gas still. I flinched away noticeably. He then said, "I'll be quick, I just need a quick ride." At this point, I believe he hasn't recognised me from the encounter at Starbucks, but I then again tell him that my parents are expecting me home any minute now, and he huffs away before finally walking off. I then finished everything and quickly gone inside my car, lock my doors and go on a different route home. I have never given a ride to a stranger and I never will. The way he was acting proves how important this is. He was obviously out there just looking for vulnerable girls, and I'm glad that I wasn't his victim.
This happened when I was about 19. My mom and my younger sister went out to the grocery store. My older brother was at a friend's house, so I had the house to myself for an hour or two. I was relaxing and watching some TV when I heard footsteps coming from upstairs. Now, I'm a very paranoid person, and I just kept telling myself that I'm okay and that it's an old house, just thinking of rational explanations. So I turned down the TV a little bit to show myself I didn't hear any footsteps. About 20 seconds after I turned down the TV, I don't hear anything. I start feeling a little comforted, until I heard my younger sister's bedroom door open. I immediately rise up, looking up the staircase. I was relieved to see it was my cat, but I thought it was weird that 1, my sister would never lock her cat in her room, and 2, I didn't know the cat had enough force to push the door open. Again, I thought that the cat snuck in and she accidentally locked him in there, and since my sister's door is so fragile, anyone can easily push the door open. Honestly, after the event, it could have been the cat, but it's still a little weird though. I start to laugh at myself, calling myself too paranoid. I sit back down on the couch and continue watching TV for another few minutes before deciding to go outside and walk around the driveway. It's the only exercise I get. I go outside and start walking around the driveway. Now, an important thing to remember, my older brother, a few months before this event happened, accidentally broke my blinds while trying to pull them up, so anyone can easily see inside my room, but I've been too busy with work and too lazy to actually buy some curtains. I'll walk around the driveway about 5 to 6 times. When I look up to my room, I see a man. I can't make him out that well, as the reflection of a tree in our yard reflected on the window. so I can make out he was 55 to 60, had gray hair, a stained green shirt, and a black baseball cap on. He didn't see me as he was snooping in my room, and I saw him holding some of my necklaces. I grabbed my phone from my pocket and started dialing the police. When I get off the phone with them and look up, the man is staring at me. He was smiling and waving his old crusty fingers before he proceeded to signal for me to come up there. I cringed and started to cry, all of this within 15 seconds. Then what happened next makes me disturbed and yet hysterical. He started wiping his ass against my window. I noped the fuck out of there, running down my street and almost getting run over by the cops. They found feces on my window and a couple of $20 bills stolen, and my closet ransacked. He must have made an escape when I was running down the road. The incident does really freak me out, knowing a man was upstairs this whole time while I was home alone, and God knows how he got in.
I was about 15 when my brother's girlfriend moved in with us. I was told that she was scared to be at home, so she moved in with us. Though I never really knew what it was that she was afraid of. I didn't really care as a kid, to be honest. I was excited at the prospect of having a sister. I was thinking about all the things I'd be able to do with her that I couldn't do with my brother. Honestly, it started out really well. I felt pretty close to her. At one point, I asked her to give me some music recommendations because I got an iPod and was excited and wanted to use it as soon as possible. Things were normal at first. After a while, I did start to notice things. Some of my stuff would go missing. Nothing major, hair clips, stuff like that. I would let my parents know that there were things that had gone missing, but I was a kid and would lose things all the time. I didn't really think it was a big deal because these things that were going missing weren't exactly major. But then accusations started. She started telling my parents that I was stealing from her, that she caught me red-handed. I had no idea what she was talking about. On many occasions, I actually pointed out to her that I didn't need any of the things that she was talking about. My parents told me not to take anything that was hers, though I think they knew that she wasn't really being honest. This happened for a long time. At one stage, I had friends over and we were making pancakes. She stormed off angrily when she saw us because I was using her frying pan. I have no idea, honestly. It's a frying pan, who cares? Anyway, cut about a year or so later. At this time, I was pretty into Tumblr. I had an account on there and would blog pretty much everything I did in a day. I remembered being really excited because I got into a certain number of followers. Then the messages started. Now, I wasn't naive. I had received anonymous messages before and thought nothing of them. People like to bring others down. For the most part, I just laughed at these messages. I responded to them with little jokes, which was my way of letting them know that I wasn't going to let them get to me. After a few days, these messages continued. Now I didn't care much until I got one that terrified me. I honestly can't remember the exact wording, but it was something along the lines of, "You think you're so good sitting on that couch upstairs? That's right, I see you." I felt myself freeze up when I read it. My heart started pounding, instinctively looking out the window, not sure what I was expecting to see. There was no one there though. Not what I could see, but whoever it was sending me was bothering me. They knew exactly where I was in my home. I had gone from laughing these messages off to being absolutely terrified. There was part of me that thought that maybe she was behind this, but I had no proof. I didn't tell my parents right away because I didn't want to tell them, then they'd not let me on the site anymore. I kept the messages from that point on. I didn't post them, I just kept them in my inbox trying to figure out what I was supposed to do. Now I remembered at one point my parents had to leave me at home alone with just my brother's girlfriend, and I told them that I was scared of her and I didn't want to stay home alone with her. Now it took a lot of convincing, but they eventually let me stay at a friend's home instead. After a while of worrying, I told a friend about what had happened. They told me that they knew a way to track the IP of the messages I was getting. I had no idea what that meant. I didn't know how that stuff worked, but I agreed to let my friend do it. I let them log on to my account, and they went through and told me that from the IP, they could tell that the person who sent the message was indeed in the same country as I was. But that didn't really narrow things down. I then asked my friend if they could check the IP of another message, one that I sent. The IP was identical to the one that had sent me those messages. It was somebody in my home. My brother wasn't really big on social websites. There was no way in hell that my parents had sent it. I felt like this was all the proof I needed. Finally, I went to my parents about this. I told them about the messages I'd gotten. I told them about the IPs and everything. My parents called my brother and his girlfriend upstairs to talk to me about it. She smiled, telling my parents that she had no idea what we were talking about. That's until my parents told her about the IPs. Suddenly, she completely lost it. She was screaming about how I was a favourite, how much she hated me. I've never been so scared before. Most of what I remembered about that night was screaming. I ended up going outside with my phone and sitting on the front lawn. I needed to get away from everything. There's not much more to say. My dad told me that she only told him that she hated me when I said I was a favourite daughter. Now I was his only daughter. After that day, I stayed as far away from her as I possibly could. When she is around, I didn't speak. I didn't want to give her any fuel. My parents told me that she wasn't taking her medication, and it probably had something to do with it. I didn't know if she was on her meds now. She and my brother moved out a while ago though. My parents tell me that she's like a different person now. She seems much happier, but I don't visit. Whenever I see her, I remember that fear. I'm sure she's a nice girl. I'm sure if she's on her medication, she can be fine. I'm sure she's doing much better, but after all the crazy stuff she did to me, I can't bring myself to face her.
I remember this story yesterday evening. I was having lunch with my brother when he asked, "Hey, are you still living at this address?" I responded with a, "No, and thank God." Here's why. This was my first house, other than the one where I had lived with my parents. I shared it with 2 other roommates, and one of them was a crackhead who was barely home, but she always paid her dues, so no problem. And there was this one night where I knew my roommates weren't gonna be home, so I went to the drugstore on the corner to get ice cream and rental movies, so that I could enjoy my night with some cookie dough and comedy. Anyways, while I biked back to my house from the store, I brought my bike up to the front porch, where I noticed the lock to my front door had been knocked off. The door was creaked slightly open, and I could see what was left of my chain lock on the floor. I didn't live in a very good neighborhood, so I always went out through the garage and hardly used the front door. And it was almost completely locked, chain, deadbolts, and everything. I knew something was wrong, and I was completely terrified. So I called the local sheriff and told him that my house had been broken into. When I told him my address, the operator went silent, then told me to call the police immediately. I called 911 while standing in the middle of the road out front of my house, ice cream in hand, ready to Ben and Jerry anyone who would come after me. And I told them what was going on. They said that they had a SWAT team on the way, and I asked the operator why.
Because that house address was given to the police station on an anonymous tip that someone was going to get murdered in.
I thought my stomach had just turned inside out.
How? I'm the only one that's supposed to be home tonight.
It was after I'd said that it hit me. My roommate, the cracked one, had said to me just a few days before we'd all have to pay our rent. I might be a little short on mine. I'm loose on the money these days and I'm struggling to pay a few other people off. I had just brushed it off at the time, but now it made sense. Cops and SWAT came and they escorted out 4 men, each of them looking like they'd each just gotten a hard hit of drugs, which they probably had. They were all taken into custody, and I'm not entirely sure what came of them, but I do know this. According to the police, my cracked friend had actually come forward. She was the original tipper, and then later confessed. She couldn't pay her debt on these guys, and so promised me as payment. Said I'd be home alone and they could do whatever they wanted to me. I haven't seen her in about 5 to 6 years now, and I never want to ever again. I moved out within the following week, and I spent each night of the following week at my said brother house, although I never did tell him why I'd moved out in the first place. He still doesn't know what happened at that place. And so, drug use in my house, I hope for your sake I never see you again. This happened about 5 years ago, in the area in which I grew up and back when I was up to no good. I have since then turned my life around and am no longer in touch with anyone from that part of my life. To give a little context and backstory, I was one of a few people that moved pain pills in my city. Most people would import cheaply made pills from around the world, so you never quite knew what was in them. Word quickly got around that I was supplying authentic ones. Because of this, I was in touch with some not so great people, and people always kept eyes on me. Business was going well and I would always carry a little bit on me, just in case. But this also attracted the wrong kind of people, obviously. This took place on a nice warm summer's day. I was walking around enjoying the weather and trying to figure out what to do with the day. Basically where I lived, there's one main road and apartments on both sides. My apartment had a parking lot in front of it. To the right of that were more apartments with rows of trees behind, and behind those trees used to be a massive field, but they had just built apartments there. So I was walking through the trees on my way to a park when I heard gunshots to my left. I jumped to a very wide tree and hid behind it. At first, I wasn't sure what was going on, but then I could see the leaves from the overgrowth around the tree move with the gunshots. I waited for silence before I peeked from behind the tree. I saw a guy in one of the windows holding a gun. I ran as fast as I could back to my block, where I then slowed down to walking pace. I don't know why I didn't go home. Instead, I opted to walk towards the big hill close to the school I went to growing up. I kept looking behind me to see if I was being followed. At first, there was no one, so I was quite relieved. Until 2 people came around the corner. My alarm bell still hadn't gone off, but I was cautious. They split up slightly, which made my alarm bells go off slightly, and I started walking faster. They sped up too, and I saw one of them reach for something in his waistline. This is when I broke into a full-on sprint. As I ran to where my childhood friend lived, which was about a 3-minute sprint, I could hear both of them behind me. When I got to her apartment building, I punched in the code to enter. Wrong code. The codes changed a few times each year. I called her and luckily she was home and let me in. I explained my situation and stayed there for a few hours before I felt safe enough to walk back home. She offered to walk with me, but I didn't want to risk it and walk back by myself. It was one nerve-wracking walk.
Thank you for watching, everyone. I want to say a massive thank you to my friend Nightmarish Tales for featuring on this video. Make sure you go and check out his channel and subscribe to him. I've got a link to his channel in the description below. We're going to be working on a couple of videos together soon, so make sure you stay posted for that. I hope you enjoyed my video and have a great day. I'll talk to you all soon, and thank you again to my friend Nightmarish Tales.